Now that we know something about the glories of magnetic nuclei, it's time to take a careful look at what I sometimes refer to as the Basic NMR Experiment, the sequence of steps that occur when we actually acquire an NMR spectrum. The nucleus I'm going to be talking about the most will of course be the hydrogen nucleus, proton, although everything we say here could basically apply to carbon-13, fluorine-19, phosphorus-31, or any other magnetic nuclei that we wish to obtain an NMR spectrum on. Here's a small neodymium magnet representing a magnetic nucleus, and I'm bringing in a large neodymium magnet representing the NMR's external magnetic field. And notice, no matter how the small magnet is oriented, when the external magnet shows up, it always aligning itself North Pole to South Pole, whether it starts off to the right, starts off to the left and pointing down, as in this case, or if it starts off pointing down and to the right, when the external field shows up, the little magnet always aligns itself with the big magnet. When we do real NMR spectra, of course, we don't have just one magnetic nuclei, we have several. We have millions of them, billions, zillions, lots of them in our NMR tubes. And therefore, a somewhat more accurate or somewhat more realistic picture would be something like this, showing many magnetic nuclei. And notice how I have them oriented randomly, some with their north poles up, some pointing down, some to the left, some to the right. The idea is, outside of any external magnetic field, the magnetic nuclei will be oriented randomly. But now we do something very interesting. We introduce the external magnetic field. Often in a diagram you will see it represented by a big arrow and often by a capital letter B, sometimes written with a subscripted 0 nearby, B naught. Exactly why they chose B and why that's used, I'm not sure. I kind of like to think it stands for big ass magnetic field, but I'm not sure if it really does or not. But it's going to be, I'm going to think about it in those terms. And when the external magnetic field shows up, all of our randomly oriented nuclei will change. Of course, they will orient with it, as pictured here. Now we have all of our magnetic nuclei all pointing in one direction. We have now done the basic setup for the NMR experiment, and now it's time to start manipulating the orientations of our magnetic nuclei. So here we are again with the magnetic nucleus aligned by the big external magnetic field. The basic NMR experiment is to do exactly this. I'm going to reach in, grab the magnetic nucleus, and turn it around. South pole to south pole with the external magnetic field. Once the energy is done, you can let go and it will return back to its original orientation. Now, of course, in reality, we don't use fingers to reach in and grab magnets. We use photons. My resemblance of my fingers to a photon is, of course, purely coincidental. We use photons to reorient our nuclei, and we measure very carefully the energy of the photons that cause that process to occur. Very often in textbooks or in other sources, instead of using pictures of neodymium magnets and little hands reaching in and manipulating them, you'll see pictures more like these, where we use arrows to represent the orientation, the random orientation of a group of magnetic nuclei such as protons out in the environment in the absence of an external magnetic field. And then we use the same kind of diagrams to show what happens when we put our nuclei in the external magnetic field, now using arrows to represent the nucleus or the various magnetic nuclei, and then we add energy in the form of photons, often represented here by h nu, and we show the magnetic nuclei reoriented in the external magnetic field. Now, south pole to south pole, the high energy configuration after the energy has been added. And then of course now they will return back to their original orientation and allow us to make this measurement again if we need to. And in fact we can repeat it several times, and when we obtain real spectra we often do. Finally, I thought we'd end this section with a field trip down to the spectrometer itself. There is the big magnet that we've been hearing about. Over here we have a sample tube prepared. It's simply our reference standard methyl ethyl ketone. So it's a sample of some molecules that we wish to study. Right here, dissolved in a little deuterated chloroform. And we get that tube in a holder and ready to go into the magnet itself. Here's the sample tube now in its holder, and we're going to place it at the top of the magnet. There it is, sitting in the sample holder, ready for it to journey down into the magnetic field. Our sample is now floated on compressed air. The computer is going to turn the air slowly off. And our magnetic nuclei, which were out in the environment in the absence of a magnetic field, are now deep within a big honkin' magnetic field. Here we set up our experimental parameters and then simply tell it to start shining photons into the sample. Here it is doing the acquisition itself. It's actually going to repeat the acquisition 8 times. In other words, it's going to shine in radio frequency light, examine the energies that get absorbed, and it's going to repeat this process 8 times. And once that is done, it will give us a picture of the spectrum on the screen. It will display the spectrum here on the screen. This is methyl ethyl ketone. You've seen it before. From here, we take the data, examine it, and learn what we can about our molecules, and move on to the next one.